Everyone, and welcome to our first webinar of the Climate Change Learning Series for Educators. We're grateful to the many educators who have taken time out of their busy schedules to join us tonight, particularly as the K-12 school year begins. This event series is supported by the University of Colorado. Our generous partners include the School of Education, CU Museum of Natural History, the Environmental Studies Department, and the Office of Outreach and Engagement. My name is Kelsey Tayne, and I'm a faculty fellow with the School of Education at CU Boulder. I'm here with Dan Liston, Professor Emeritus of the School of Education, and will be your host for tonight's event. We're also joined by Kim Strong and Anna Noble, doctoral students in the School of Education, who are helping this event run as smoothly as possible. Tonight, we are joined by three fantastic speakers. Each of our speakers will share a 15-minute presentation, and following presentations, we'll all come together for a 30-minute question and answer discussion with our speakers. Throughout the webinar, we encourage you to post your questions into the Q&A box located along the bottom tab of your screen. If you have a question for a particular speaker, you can note that in your question. If you have technical questions or concerns that arise during the webinar, post a question or send us a message in the chat, and Kim or Anna will try to support you. Okay. Tonight's webinar is focused on climate change learning and justice. Climate change is a multifaceted issue of social and ecological injustice. It is contributed to and shaped by colonialism, capitalism, exploitation, and oppression. Climate change has the potential to impact everyone, but disproportionately harms people from marginalized communities as well as non-human living beings and ecosystems. Younger generations will face the greatest burden of the climate crisis and related ecological degradation. But around the world, adolescents are thinking about climate change and working to create a more just and sustainable future. Education plays a critical role in how we as a society can work towards greater socio-environmental justice and sustainability. Teachers, informal educators, and youth organizers can help adolescents grapple with the complexities of climate injustice and help equip youth of all ages with tools and knowledge to act towards climate justice across multiple scales.
Hi, I'm Dan, and we have a fantastic lineup of speakers today. First, we'll be joined by Professor David Pellow. For his webinar presentation, Pellow will discuss how he engages his students in learning about environmental and climate justice from an applied perspective, as well as how he works with students to apply key concepts towards imagining and making change in the community. In particular, this includes a project focused on creating a framework for a Green New Deal. We're also lucky to have Dr. Deb L. Morrison speaking with us tonight. Morrison will discuss issues concerning the systemic context of environmental and climate justice learning, especially as it relates to action. She maintains that climate change learning needs to foster equitable collaborations and bridge cultural differences. She'll provide a few case examples of what this type of learning has looked like. Finally, Professor Megan Bang will join us tonight. Bang will discuss the complex intertwining of human and natural systems as societies are grappling with profound issues like racial justice, public health, and economic injustice. She underscores that all of this occurs amidst and is shaped by rapidly shifting ecological systems and changing climates. She raises critical questions related to education in these changing times and highlights features of field-based science learning environments that adequately and ethically engage learners in climate change education, projects that she has developed through collaborative projects over time.
All right, so first up is Professor David N. Pellow. David is the Delson Chair and Professor of Environmental Studies and Director of the Global Environmental Justice Project at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His teaching, research, and activism focus on the environmental justice in the US and globally. His books include What is Critical Environmental Justice?, The Slums of Aspen, Immigrants vs. the Environment in America's Eden, written with Lisa Sunhee Park, The Silicon Valley of Dreams, environmental injustice, immigrant workers, and the high-tech global economy, also with Lisa Sunhee Park, and Garbage Wars, the struggle of environmental justice in Chicago. He has served on the board of directors of Greenpeace USA and International Rivers. Here's David.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's really wonderful to be here with you all today. I bring you greetings from unceded Indigenous Chumash territory, also known as Santa Barbara, California. So today I'm going to be talking about engaging students around climate justice, some concepts, but most importantly around action and drawing directly from experiences in my classrooms and in my research lab and in the community. So there are three main teaching and learning goals I want to touch on today. The first is making sure that I'm guiding students to think critically. And a big part of that is seeing the world differently, seeing the world in a different light, and seeing themselves differently in that world, and primarily seeing themselves as agents of change. The second goal is to assist students in communicating any of the ideas that they have come across in class and conclusions that they have reached from engaging the class materials and each other, and communicating that knowledge in written, verbal, visual, or artistic formats. And third, and finally, last but not least, I'm hoping to inspire students to act in peaceful, productive, nonviolent ways, but to create positive and enduring change in our communities. So one thing I know for sure is that many of us have students in our classrooms who themselves are from backgrounds, from communities where they have engaged or have experienced climate threats and risks and environmental threat and risks. And so the town of Oxnard, California is a very good example, just south of me here in the central coast of California. This town, where many of my students come from, is some 85% people of color, it's 75% Latinx, and it is a majority working class, low income, low wealth. This town of Oxnard, California, has for generations really served as a foundation, a source where energy from electricity, from power plants has been generated for the rest of the region. And in many ways, this really encapsulates what we mean by climate injustice and environmental injustice, because you have a vulnerable community, mostly people of color, low wealth, working class folks, who are bearing the brunt, paying the cost of this polluting technology. They're getting the particulate matter, they're getting asthma. Many neighborhoods in the town of Oxnard are in the 90th percentile of asthma sufferers in the state of California, and yet they're getting very little of the benefits. The electricity is going to my town, Santa Barbara, and other middle class and wealthier communities. So they had 3 power plants in their community, more than any other on California's coastline. And just a few years back, there was a proposal for yet a 4th power plant. And so people decided that they'd had enough. And a number of students on my campus and in my class joined with non-governmental organizations in researching this problem and mobilizing against this 4th power plant proposal. And in the end, they were successful. They stopped the proposal, but they didn't stop there. They continued to promote positive practices and policies such as wetlands restoration and the protection of critical habitat and the expansion of good paying, clean jobs. In the end, they won this battle. The power plant was not built. And so this is a very powerful example of a community fighting for climate and environmental justice. And I'm proud that a number of my students were involved in this mobilization, because again, for many of them, it was deeply personal because this is where they are from. So that's an example of what I'm talking about in terms of climate injustice and the struggle for climate justice. Let me be very clear about these concepts. Climate injustice is the term that many of us use to describe the fact that climate change impacts communities and nations and regions of the globe very differently, very unevenly. So Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, low wealth communities, immigrants, women, and communities in the global South tend to be hit first and hardest by anthropogenic climate change. So that's what we don't want. That's what we're fighting against. What we're fighting for is climate justice. And this again is a vision that, as you saw in the Oxnard case, that it is aimed at addressing climate change while also simultaneously alleviating the unequal burdens that are being created by it. So that's it in terms of the concepts. I want to keep it simple tonight with respect to that, but I'm happy to engage questions about other concepts that I deal with in my teaching. So in my courses, I always have students do a final project. At the end of the term, they can do an individual or a group project where they really have a huge amount of choice, huge amount of agency over what they're doing. And this comes usually in 4 different broad flavors. The first is a term paper, traditional research project, or they can choose a strategy paper. This is a paper that they write. It's unsolicited advice that is aimed at a company, a government agency, some organization out there that they think could go to the next level in terms of improving their ability to promote environmental or climate justice. So this is intended to be friendly advice. The third is a community engagement project where students join or volunteer with an organization in the community that is doing work on environmental or climate justice, or even more exciting, a student actually launches, founds their own organization. This has happened a number of times, and they report back on their progress. Fourth is an artistic project. Students make films, they do videos, they do music, paintings, artwork, you name it, to express themselves and informed by the data, by the science that we've been engaging with in the class in a way that reaches people at a different register. Or you can do a combination of any or all of the above. The strategy paper, I'm pleased to announce that a number of students have followed that path with great success. One student, for example, is from Los Angeles, and one of his favorite organizations is Friends of the LA River. This is a group that's trying to protect the LA River, right? And so they're interested in conservation, climate change, all of this great stuff in a community that is majority working class and people of color. So this is a good opportunity to intervene on an environmental and climate justice issue. Where the student wrote a strategy paper suggesting that this organization, Friends of the LA River, could do a whole slew of things that apparently they hadn't considered before to increase their impact, their visibility, the positive effect of the organization. He was contacted by the executive director of the organization via email and said, I read your paper, I liked your paper, would you like an internship? And so I was very proud of this because this was just one of many examples where the kinds of things that students are doing in my classes, the skills they're learning are really paving a career path for many of them. And that, I think, is where the rubber hits the road for many of them. A number of students each year write children's books. Initially, I was like, oh, really, are we going to do this? But the quality of some of these children's books is amazing. A number of students have said they want to do this because they weren't exposed to these ideas or these concepts when they were younger. And so they feel like they need to give back to the younger generation. And so this children's book, written and illustrated by one student, Veronica Gonzalez, Let's Fight for Our Backyard, tells the story of this community in Santa Barbara, which recently in the San Marcos Foothills Preserve was facing a development project that was going to literally destroy this beautifully biodiverse region that is on indigenous Chumash land and create high-end luxury housing. So this student was saying, we're not going to have this. I'm going to write a children's book that addresses this issue. And she was part of a broader mobilization, a struggle that actually raised millions of dollars to literally pay off the developers so that they wouldn't destroy this beautiful gem of indigenous and biodiverse land. So this was an enormous success. This student, Marcela Leal, wrote a children's book as well, Mindy the Mindful Butterfly, beautifully illustrated, deals with a whole range of environmental and climate issues. A colleague of mine who's the editor at a local publisher, the Climate Justice Press, got wind of this, reached out to Marcela and said, I'd love to publish your book, and did. You can actually get a copy of Marcela's book on the Climate Justice Press's website. Another amazing project that a group of students did was focused on fast fashion. That, of course, refers to the trendy, cheap clothing that is really produced at a breakneck speed by textile industries, selling this stuff to consumers around the world, who often very shortly after that just discard it because you got to keep up with the Joneses, you got to keep up with the trends, the newest, the latest, the greatest. That sounds great, except This, along with the rest of the textile industry, is actually deeply harmful to our environment because of the waste and because of the fossil fuels that are used. So this is also harmful to our climate. So this group of students came together to address this crisis, the crisis of fast fashion, with this community engagement project. They created a store, a trading post where people can come and give away old or unwanted clothing, and where other folks can show up and need that clothing and get it for free or at a low cost. This is a powerful way to combat environmental and climate risks while also meeting the basic needs of people who are often low income, low wealth, and it also builds and creates community. This project also, of course, involved not only creating this trading post, but then as you can see on this slide, the students actually wrote a guide for people anywhere in the world to use so that they could do the same. Every year I have a number of students who ask me, what kind of research are you doing? And I say, well, this is what I'm doing. I'm doing a project on the relationship between climate, environmental justice, and prisons. And so a number of students in my classes have been doing this work in their classes for credit or joining my lab. And so here's some examples of what we've been finding. On the left side, we have two photos that speak to what's happening with climate in prisons in Texas. Heat-related deaths in the state of Texas has killed some 24 prisoners in the last 20 some odd years. Climate-driven heat events, climate-driven weather events like Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Maria. The lower left there, FCI Beaumont. Beaumont is a federal correctional institution in Beaumont, Texas, that was flooded, and the prisoners there nearly drowned in that extreme weather event. In California, on the right side, nearly a third of our firefighting workforce are incarcerated people. These folks are being asked, and if not forced, to do very dangerous, if not lethal work of fighting fires year-round. These firefighting seasons, of course, are being inflected by and influenced by climate change. This is deeply dangerous work. So students are interested in this. Some of their friends and relatives are in prison or jail. So this also hits home for a number of our students. And every year, my students take their research, put it together, we edit it, we do peer reviewing, and we publish it in an annual report. And it gets out there and people around the world are reading it. So they're applying themselves and they're building skills. I was also pleased just 2 years ago to get some funding from the Andrew Mellon Foundation for the Sawyer Seminar, where I brought together 2 classes, graduates and undergraduates, around the theme of energy and climate justice. These folks were doing research collaborating with non-governmental organizations like the Central Coast Climate Justice Network in my region of California to uncover and make visible a whole host of issues around climate struggles and energy, like oil and gas drilling. So students were writing op-eds. I can see here on the left an op-ed in the Ventura County Reporter newspaper calling for a moratorium on oil drilling in Ventura County. Ventura County is working class and majority people of color. Oil was found in the agricultural fields in parts of Ventura County, in the water that's being fed into our food. And so we got a moratorium passed, but would that moratorium be extended? A number of students also wrote letters to the Board of Supervisors in the county around a whole range of issues. They went out and mobilized, handing out petitions to people at Whole Foods and the local mercado, getting a multiracial group of folks to come out to the Board of Supervisors in the County of Ventura meeting a couple of years ago, and succeeded in getting the moratorium on oil drilling in parts of Ventura County passed and extended. Finally, my students have been working with me on a Green New Deal project here in Santa Barbara County and Ventura County. As we all know, the Green New Deal, the federal Green New Deal resolution, is aimed at addressing climate change while also building a sustainable, equitable, and resilient ecologically sustainable economy. Well, there are a number of Green New Deal proposals that have passed and been proposed around the country in various cities and counties and states and regions. We're working on one here. So my students got together with a number of folks from local non-governmental organizations, and we interviewed about 400 people in our region, asking them, what would you like to see in your community? What would you like to see less of in your community? What would you like to see in the form of a Green New Deal? So a broad swath of humanity was included in this project. And we grouped all of the statements for solutions and problems in three large buckets: infrastructure and economy, social justice, and democracy. And as you can see next to those three buckets, a number of other very specific proposals around energy and transportation, housing, indigenous justice, racial justice, and making sure that we strengthen our community-based organizations so we can have a democracy that can deliver sustainability and climate justice. So to conclude, I want to answer the question, why do I teach climate justice? There are a number of reasons. You know, a lot of us think of environmental and climate issues as scientific or technical in nature, and they certainly are. But the bottom line is social inequality is the most important driving force behind our ecological crises. Students really, really start to understand this when we look at history, when we look at their communities. I was reminded of the great Canadian journalist, Naomi Klein. She reminded me that the very first financial supports for the economic system that gave us global climate change came, in fact, from systems of racial violence, colonialism, conquest, genocide, and enslavement. It's baked into our DNA. We're not going to solve the climate crisis unless we deal with the inequality crisis, unless we deal with the democracy crisis. The good news is that the empirical research, and my students study this very closely, shows quite clearly that equality and democracy are actually good for the environment and for the climate. And finally, students love learning new things and making positive change. And so I've had a great time working with them, and I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. I really appreciated hearing about the variety of examples where students had choice and agency to work on climate justice issues in your classroom. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And next up, we're going to hear from Deb Morrison, who's a learning scientist at the University of Washington, Seattle. Deb works at the intersection of justice, climate science, and learning. Her focus is on research practice policy partnerships, ranging from local community efforts to international endeavors. In this work, Deb attempts to understand complex socio-ecological systems through design-based and action-oriented research, as well as improved human-environment relationships and sustainability. Deb draws on an eclectic range of justice theory to inform her work and to foster her continued journey for transformative liberation. And more information about her can be found at www.debmorrison, all one word, .me. Deb.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit today about not working and infrastructuring. So I'm going to think about the support teachers to do the work that we are doing in all sorts of places, and many others are doing as well. I'm coming to you today, and I'm living and working in traditional and unceded Wet'suwet'en territory. And so I will get my chat back up here and throw a link in there for folks. Okay, so sorry, there was a little bit of changeover on my screen as I started. All right, so I'm going to talk first a little bit about how I conceptualize climate justice learning, and then we'll kind of dig into how we support this. So when we're thinking about climate justice learning, we have to think both about what do you teach about and how do you teach it. Those two things are very intersectional. And so as you think about those two things, there's a broad question that expands across all of this, is who is making these decisions and for whom? Who is making the decision about what we teach and who is making the decision about how we teach? I also want to put on the table an idea about what climate justice is. And there are many different understandings of climate justice, as many as there are different contexts and communities in which we work. And so I thought I would draw from an international example. This is from the Mary Robinson Foundation. Mary Robinson herself is part of the elders.org, which is an international independent group of global leaders working together for peace, justice, and human rights. And she was the past president of Ireland. The organization that she works for is founded by Nelson Mandela, and it's currently chaired by Mary Robinson. And so she talks about this idea that climate justice is about participating in decision making. It's about openness to partnerships, and that the idea is about who is involved in those partnerships needs to be those most affected by climate change. And often those most affected by climate change may be least able to adequately deal with it in some ways. I do want to challenge that a little bit, because we have to also reframe how we're even thinking about the resources that people and communities are bringing to the table. All right, so first is this idea of not working. So when we're thinking about building climate justice, where do we start with that inside learning? Often we're with the sort of ball of yarn on the left side of the picture here. And we want to work towards some vision. We don't know what vision necessarily, but we're working towards some vision that's a little more coherent. And to do this, we want to weave together, or we want to build into knots, the idea of communities, of people, of networks. And so how we do this is a little bit of the question. Some of the examples of the way that people are starting to think about not working, the Learning for Justice group, which was the Teaching Tolerance group before, has an enormous amount of resources, professional learning resources, to think about working across boundaries, which a lot of not working is this idea of bridging across different communities respectfully and equitably. So they have an enormous amount of resources for thinking about and doing that. I've also provided here a case example of the networking design and support that went on in the Washington State Climb Time Initiative. And that initiative was legislatively funded. It's in its 4th year now, and it's trying to work across all different community and school-based contexts with tribal nations, compact schools, in all different ways and constellations of people and organizations. And so lots of challenges when you're starting to bridge different communities. And so how we support that is part of that narrative of not working. So there's an example there, a narrative case of it. A huge part of this work is understanding your own positionality. Thanks, Tiffany. A huge part of this work is understanding your own positionality and your own sort of way that you are positioned and that you position yourself. And often we categorize people into all sorts of groups, but people are much more complex than that, and so are communities. And all of these identities have histories in place, in community, in time, as people have moved across space. And so understanding this is critical. Every one of us has these intersectional aspects to our identities. I will make the slides available after, and a ton of resources are in the notes for the slides for folks. So what we want to do as we build across these differences and we start to examine ourselves is we want to infrastructure. So we want to engage people in learning activities with different types of resources that can help them bridge this understanding, learn new things, push themselves. There's a lot of different initiatives that are working on this in sort of different arms of it. One of the biggest ones is the Access Project, which is advancing coherent and equitable systems of science education. The Access Project is helping to produce a number of different resources. Some of those resources are geared toward different aspects of socio-ecological systems and caring. Some are geared toward place-based learning. Others may be geared toward sustainable development goals or climate change. There's a wide variety of resources coming out of that initiative. Again, the Climb Time Initiative specifically is building resources that are climate specific. And Climate Generation out of Minnesota is also doing a lot of infrastructuring work. So those are types of professional learning or resource building, and all of this type of effort that I've just named, those are all collaborative efforts. So they're built with people who are experiencing the challenge and to try and resource a specific need. Again, as we start to build resources, we also have to think about equity. And this is a simpler version that is being used inside the Access Project right now to think about, like, what are the specific equity projects that we can start to think about and really design deep into that area to help people learn and build. So the place-based learning and ecological caring arm here is going to actually be an area where we're really centering a lot of the climate work. Yeah. The other thing to understand when we think about climate justice work is not everyone frames it that way. Many people frame it as environmental justice, and the issues that are brought up, or ecological caring, and the issues that are named might be different depending on the community that is learning and working in that place. So this brief, which is the STEM Teaching Tool 71, is really helpful at trying to understand what these different dimensions are. However, knowledge of science alone is not enough at all. That's very clear from the research. There's been research that really pushes the idea of socio-scientific issues. So how are we framing things in these social realities that people are living in the social histories in which people are right now? And so these organizations that I've linked to here and provided the links in the notes, they're really doing the work. They are in the space right now, highly engaged in climate-related, environment-related justice work. And so thinking about teaching socioscientific issues alone is not enough. We have to center justice issues and solutions that are defined by the communities most impacted. And so to do that, we need to be in collaboration with these communities in respectful and meaningful ways and reciprocal ways that are not just transactional. So I've also included some resources for collaborative guides, how to engage in collaboration. You also need to learn on your own. You need to do work. And so there's some starting points here for understanding intersectional issues of justice, following hashtags, following different organizations, news feeds, understanding what are those socioscientific issues that are the center of people's work. So that is also very important, just to educate yourself on what are the issues that people are facing and that are most critical to different communities. There's also a little bit more general work, and I know we're not in the emotion section of the webinar series, but I can't not say that. One of the most impactful books for me lately has been this book, All We Can Save. And it is a compilation from a lot of different, I think it's all women, feminist writers around different ideas and ways of thinking of framing the work. And so really trying to understand the broad issues is also very helpful when it comes to climate change. Candace Callison's book is also very helpful in terms of thinking about how different communities frame issues to understand how you can bridge that. And then I really, even though it's not climate specific, really want to highlight Bettina Love's book, We Want to Do More Than Just Survive. It's on abolition teaching. There was a number of pieces of that book that just stood out as bright spots to help think about how we're actually teaching. So the how of teaching is part of that. And all of these books really focus on the idea that to avoid despair, we really need to teach action. We need to focus on that action component. All right, I know that Megan is going to be talking about learning in places, but I did want to just highlight that as we're learning around environment and climate justice issues, we need personal and community connections in our teaching. We need to think about how we're connecting to the problem, consequences, and solutions. We need to think about how we're connecting to the people engaged in the work. Are they being involved in the curriculum design? Are they in our classrooms? Are we out in their spaces? We need to think about how we're connecting to place, to history, culture, language. All of those aspects of learning are critical. Language is often an understated one because language holds with it so many things about values and meaning. And so really understanding that just translating language is not necessarily what we need to be doing. There are a number of different examples here. I did want to also highlight the SDGs. There's a Education for Sustainable Development at the international level, and these sustainable development goals are actually a really helpful framework for those of you who may be working in environments where it's difficult to name climate change, but you want to connect to issues of justice or issues of concern in the community. This is a good framework to help think about what those issues might be. And then a few networks of things that are helpful sort of resources for just thinking and connecting. The last one here, the Climate Action Childhood Network, is for elementary level, and it provides a number of excellent examples of casework that are place-based, justice-centered learning. So all related to climate. And I will pause there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Deb. That was a great talk, and thank you for all of the resources that you provided. It's great to know too about more of the groups that are doing this justice work. So thank you for all of those resources. So next up, we have, finally, we're going to hear from Professor Megan Bang. Megan Bang is Ojibwe and of Italian descent. She is a professor of the learning sciences and psychology at Northwestern University, and she currently serves as the senior vice president of the Spencer Foundation. Megan studies the dynamics of culture, learning, and development from preschool to adulthood, with a focus on creating and implementing more effective and more just learning environments. She conducts research in schools, informal learning environments, and everyday community contexts. She is focused on intergenerational, place-based, field-based learning environments that aim to support Indigenous resurgence through STEAM. Megan is a former preschool, middle school, and high school teacher. She has and continues to serve on numerous activist and scholarly boards and committees. She is a mother, auntie, grandmother, sister, and daughter. Everyone welcome Megan Bang.
Thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm excited to share some work with you all. I'll start by just telling you all that I'm coming to you from my original territories in the Great Lakes, the homes of Three Fires people, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. Many of you know this place as Chicago. And this is the beach right near my house. So I'm excited to share work with you tonight. And if all of you are freaking out about my slides, we'll see where I get. I always do this where I have a couple that I usually skip. I wanted to just start tonight by kind of giving you my core argument, because I'm going to give some really big picture things that I think are really important as we're thinking about what are we really up to with climate change education. And I'm going to argue that we need a climate change education that reshapes human relationships with the natural world at its core. And it really requires an expansion of what we think is core to science education along some core dimensions. For me in my work, it's fundamentally understanding how human and natural worlds are construed and shape human thought, human decision-making, human action at all kinds of levels. There's a lot to this tonight. My goal is to give you some enough examples and teasers that you want to go and look and dig in more deeply. And so I'm going to give you a few of those tonight. But to start, I just want to acknowledge that none of the work I'm showing you tonight I've done solo. This is a labor of love that has been going on for a long time with many different communities and different partners across school systems, tribal communities, and universities. But I want to start by just saying, what do I mean by what I call nature-culture relations? And there's a whole body of research that has demonstrated over time that there are really kind of two foundational human models, cognitive models of human relationships with the natural world. One in which humans are apart from the natural world and distinct and kind of special life on Earth, and one in which human beings are part of. And so I've been up to studying the development of these from very young ages all the way through elderhood, thinking about how we infrastructure this in classrooms, and really trying to understand how is it that these two core models can help us think about our forms of education. And partly, I argue in our work that these two distinct models are central to how we engage in education, and therefore are also central to how we're going to transform it in order to create the kind of education we need. It's important, though, for us to think pretty concretely about how did we get here? And I mean, over broad periods of time, lots of people think we know how we got here. But in my work and as Indigenous people, one of the core arguments I think that I believe in and that many Indigenous scholars and elders believe is that there has been a restructuring of relations between humans and the natural world through what we think about as the transformation of kin relations, when we think about the more than human world as kin, as the primary organization of how you engage in life, to institutions of what I would call white human supremacy and extraction. And here are some of my favorite mentors and scholars thinking about these things. And Joe Heinrich is a evolutionary psychologist who has really tracked some of the impacts of this change in thinking on all kinds of things and how human communities have evolved. And so it's important to really recognize that what we're talking about here didn't happen overnight, and that actually our solutions need to be careful that they aren't actually same paradigms dressed up with new labels in particular kinds of ways. And it's important for me, for people to recognize that oftentimes we have views of the world and the issues that are actually inaccurate, and that these transformations have been global. I love to show this spectacular map by Garnett and colleagues that demonstrates that actually a quarter of all land is still in Indigenous hands. Most people don't know that, can't fathom this, and it shifts actually we might consider what it means to take broad global scale action, unless we're assuming that the Western world will continue to dominate and decide what happens, particularly when we consider that 80% of the world's biodiversity is in Indigenous territories. So if we care about ecological collapse and changing times of climate, then they were predicated on particular relations. In the United States, if you're in the United States, you no doubt have been shaped by a powered system that is invested in you thinking that we're dead, and that there are very few of us left with very few access to resources. And part of the problem is we live in a country that infrastructures this invisibility at grand scales. So the good news is, I would argue also for those of you who are science educators, is that I actually think there are really important shifting conceptual, societal, legal, economic, and scientific paradigms afoot. One of the things that happens oftentimes, unless you're in kind of graduate level science education, is students don't tend to get engaged at these edges as they're learning. And so they get dated science and they get dated perspectives. And I would argue teachers don't actually get opportunities to always be engaged at the edges of the disciplines. And what's really cool about it is the edges of the disciplines, I think, are moving towards really conceptually trying to engage and study ethical, complex socio-ecological systems in all kinds of ways. For example, this is another kind of dazzling paper by Shell and colleagues that show that you can't understand ecological systems and their change anymore unless you're also layering social systems and understanding how social systems are consequential for all of the kind of natural and scientific outcomes that are often central to science education. And really, in this study, I'd highly recommend you go look at this. Does a brilliant job of understanding how residential segregation, resource distribution actually end up being clearly consequential for biodiversity and both the degradation as well as regeneration of biodiversity. So my point here is just to say that the things that we're talking about are at the edges of the discipline. So if we're not figuring out how to do this in education all of the time, we are actually participating in not preparing the next generation of leaders or young people to have the knowledge they'll need to survive, to run societies, to be leaders, to have sustainable families. All of which I think most of the time people believe that's what we should be up to. And for me, this is really core to our really basic construction of learning environments. And what we argue in our work is that an apart from model dominates education and increasingly in everyday life in the US. Literally, we sequester children into buildings where there's very little more than human life, are in boxes to learn. And that actual place of learning is consequential to how learning unfolds, what can be learned. And we've kind of heard that in different ways. And so we've really been working on thinking about what does it mean to shift this apart from model? And I'm partly wanting everyone to recognize that the average American child spends 4 to 7 minutes a day in unstructured outdoor time. That is it. The transformation in childhood over the past 50 or 60 years is profound, has neurological consequences, has biological consequences. And it means that our human constructions of the natural world that mediate learning and the kind of assumptions underneath them are flooded throughout these indoor environments. And so we really have to think about this representational ecosystem and what are the core models. And we've done a lot of work to show from early childhood books through children's media up through text and curriculum that this apart from model is embedded everywhere. The other thing that's important for us to kind of know and hold is that there's been a significant decline in people's knowledge about the plant and animal life in the 20th century. And as that degradation of kind of broad scale knowledge has been happening, it impacts all kinds of things like anthropocentric reasoning and kinds of decision making. So really part of what we're after is shifting, to really think about what we call part of models. That part of what does it mean to have that? And I guess I want to say a couple of things, and you're going to see this pull out. For me, I come to this work with the ethical commitment to transform formal education from being a weapon and tool of colonialism that has impacted negatively, deliberatively on Indigenous communities into, can it be something that contributes to our collective good? And for me, that has meant that we have to do the work of thinking about coloniality, about decolonization, about anti-racism, and the fundamental assumptions that go into teaching and learning always. Now, this is important for Indigenous communities. I would argue that actually this is just important for everybody. But when I started my work, I am and continue to be, but I really focused, and that was the ethics that drove me. I say that because I think that as we're doing this work, we need to be clear about your positionality. You also need to be clear about your ethics and what is driving and motivating your own focus, because it will drive how your practice works, what you think is important to attend to, and how things unfold. So what I'm going to try to do is just sort of tell you a little bit about what we call a part of models or field-based science education. And part of why we've done that is that over the last 20 years, we have accumulating evidence that actually a part of models, learning outdoors, and I don't mean field trips, I mean routine investigations in outdoor places, actually support socio-ecological systems learning and decision-making. Even we have a project that I'm going to show you today that started with PK3. So part of what we used to do is say that young children aren't capable of this kind of sophisticated thought. And we've been really on trying to understand that under what conditions is it possible to shift things. The other thing that we think field-based science education really does is it expands opportunities for scientific learning to be connected to everyday lives. We've heard this a little bit, and to be consequential for people's everyday lives. It transforms family and community engagement paradigms. And in our work, what has been really central is that we have been engaged in learning driven by what we call should we questions. That is an ethically driven question that motivates the need for scientific inquiry and to understand how it is that socio-ecological systems actually work. And so I love this quote. I've been driven by it for a long time, but that places produce and teach particular ways of thinking about and being in the world. They tell us the way things are, even when they operate pedagogically beneath the conscious level. So if we're only letting kiddos outside 7 to 9 minutes a day, it's no wonder, and that's been going on for a couple generations, it becomes more and more evident about how our everyday practices actually are helping to contribute to our ongoing climate crisis. So you might be saying, great, get the big ideas, but how do I actually do this? And part of what I want to say is that Deb already kind of started this. This is lovely in for me, is I really think we need to think about educational tools that are towards possible futures and that are always open and shifting. And so for us, that's what I've been up to for a long time. But it also means that we need to think about tool paradigms that are beyond kind of industrialized capitalist paradigms of expansion. Because unfortunately, most of educational tools have capitalist roots, even in the way we think about scale and the way that we think about finance. And so I'm really thrilled by seeing the kind of increase of people making freely available tools. I'm going to highlight an example tonight, partly to show you how you could pull things like power and historicity all the way through field-based learning. And all of these are available online too. So the example that I want to show you is, and the ways that we've infrastructured some of these ideas is from a Learning in Places project. This project was a 4-year participatory design research project. We co-designed this with teachers, school district leaders, CBOs, researchers, and families. Also, for those of you who are wondering, it's NGSS aligned. You can get to all the standards that you're legislated to get to. And we've engaged hundreds and hundreds of children and families in this project thus far. What I want to do is focus a little bit about why I think model building and thinking about these tools, these material tools, are really important. And for us, you're not going to get all this tonight, but I wanted you to have a sense that we really thought about the layers of tools that were important for educators. So in some ways, what you all should read is these learning engagements are like the curricular materials that probably are somewhat familiar. I think ours are prettier than most, but and actually graphically organized really well. But those learning engagements are kind of like standard curriculum in some ways. But part of what we've done is layered all these other pieces in to help educators think about the paradigm shifts and the practice shifts and the ways of seeing children, their families, their communities, and even lands and waters differently. Because the kind of shift that we're asking for in education, I don't think is particularly easy, and I've been doing it for 20 years. So part of what I want to show you tonight is this is what we call our project rhizome, and it really is a graphic of what are our core commitments. You shouldn't make sense of any of it right now, other than what I wanted to make visible is that at the foundation, in the background of all of these things, is this construct of nature-culture relations. How are we constructing a part of relations, or when are we slipping into apart from? And how is power and historicity always mediating these things? And so tonight, what I wanted to give you a sense is these learning frameworks, partly because they're useful, whether you're teaching preschool or if you're teaching graduate school. I happen to use them across the spectrum now of when I'm teaching. And these frameworks are really, they're synthesized research and literature, but they're designed in such a way that helps educators hold really complex ideas, gives language to some of these things, and then concretizes them. How do you think about these frameworks when you're designing? How do you use them in practice? How do you see what it would look like to take this seriously in practice? How do you see it in student thinking? What's an example in a classroom? And then we have a series of educator reflection tools where you can kind of do some self-assessments for yourself to see where you are around these bigger ideas. I'll just say our frameworks are deliberately interconnected, and I'm going to show you that so that you can see how power and historicity is pulled through our entire learning environment always. And just to note, I am completely, I think that language diversity in our efforts is really critical, or what we're doing is reproducing global North paradigms and privilege. So I really appreciated that point, Deb. So here's an example, right? You just saw power and historicity. You don't need to make sense of all the details. This is another framework that is really helping educators understand some of the core relationships and socio-ecological systems that come from social and ecological sciences. But we help them, oftentimes the teacher materials for these kinds of things actually leave power and historicity off the table in helping educators understand it. And so our framework has been deliberate about inserting that always across all of these paradigms so that we might understand these core concepts, not in ahistorical ways, or not in ways that can sidestep dealing with powered dynamics in them. This example, and if you'll see this, the blue circle on the outside is again pulling through that power and historicity. This is our framework for how do you support ethical deliberation and decision-making about socio-ecological systems in classrooms. What we learned from educators is they were down to do this, but they needed frameworks, they needed tools about how to get into these really complex issues with students. Lots of them wanted to, but were nervous about how to do that well. And so we really worked on frameworks that helped educators think through how would you do this? What do you need to make sure that you go through with kiddos to really make good decisions? And again, we're always making sure along inquiries that power and historicity are always shaping these things, and that there is no perfect evidence for these things. So you have to make decisions in particular ways. And you have to think about how do you use scientific knowledge to make complex policy decisions that may not have all the answers yet, right? And I think the other thing that I just want to highlight before I kind of get to ending is The other thing that we've been working a lot on is that most classrooms are designed to focus on the individual or the individual good, and that largely American classrooms have been focused on individuals and have not done a great job of cultivating a sense of collective good. And so this is a deep cultural norm in the United States. People pride themselves on it. Go watch any early childhood cartoon and you'll be like, whew, that starts really young, where it's, I'm so proud of me. It is all about the I. And this is a massive cultural shift, right? It also is a cultural shift to think about, do humans continue to think we're entitled to dominate life on the planet? And the answer is largely yes. Humans still think that. And even many of our climate solutions are not about changing those fundamental beliefs. And so we think about what are decision making that actually go all the way down to that level. I want to just show part of one of the big things about our learning environments. I mentioned this, but I'll show you that we have frameworks that really, what does it mean to engage in scientific inquiry driven by should we questions? And we really show here that you start with some of these ethical deliberations, some of this power and historicity around big questions, ethical questions around what should we do in order to motivate investigation questions and make relevant why are investigation questions really important. One of the things that we've learned over time is that when you do this, learners are much more attentive to the quality of their investigations if they are motivated by ethical decisions that they feel responsible to. So we have a whole framework about this. I wanted to show you something quickly. This is how educators step through our storyline for the Learning in Places project, but I wanted to make visible that the should we questions and those wonderings and our engagement with families and communities happen all the way across instruction. They're not only at the beginning to motivate interest, and they're not only at the end to translate what we've learned, that they're integrated across inquiry. You don't need to, I know this is a lot and you're probably all like, I can't make sense of all that. Just pay attention to the pink and recognize like, okay, you're talking about always doing this, making this routine in instruction, not a one-off event or particularly located in instruction. So I'm not sure how much time I have left. If I could can I take 2 more minutes? Kelsey, is that okay?
Absolutely. Take as much time as you want.
Okay. So some of you might be like, okay, this sounds good. Do you have any evidence that it actually impacts learning? And so I just want to give you one of my former students who's now a faculty member, did some work on one aspect of our project that I happen to find dazzling, Charlene Nolan. And we studied, as part of our curricular materials, we have these family tools where families are always engaged and kids are bringing the things that they're doing with their families into classroom instruction. And we had them divided experimentally between indoor discourse-based activities for family tools and outdoor discourse and observational kind of mobile activities. Essentially, we created these tools where families were either talking about phenomena inside their homes or they were going for walks in their neighborhoods, observing phenomena and talking about it. And she studied the differences in what we got. So I'm going to tell you that our analysis was really motivated by kind of core understandings of kid cognition around the natural world and these different domains. We were looking at how are kids thinking about natural kinds, things like rocks, water, sunlight. How are they thinking about species, largely animals and plants? There's a few other things in there. And then places, what was the reasoning about places? All of these tools that we collected were coded and we distinguished between human animals and non-human animals. So on the left here on this screen, where you have the big red bar, are the family discussion models, the family discussion tools. And all of the red, the family of red, is involving humans. On the right, and I think I actually, are family walk tools. Same families, different activity configuration. What we see is a really different pattern of attention, where families are no longer engaged in anthropocentric thought. They are actually expanding and thinking about all kinds of relevant relationships. They're still as human beings. We don't want human beings totally gone from activity and from thought, but there is a massive shift. And part of what I just want to make clear about this is that these simple tool shifts and thinking carefully about how we're asking kiddos to engage, we see at a grain size that we're not like saying, you know, this isn't their final report or this isn't like a one-offer. these were tools sprinkled across instruction where we were seeing differences in attentional habits, ideational habits. And so for us, this is really simple, but actually fairly profound evidence that the simple construction of where, the places that we engage in learning, really do have impact on what we're learning and how we're thinking. And so for us, this is one example. We have lots of other examples, but I often feel like this is one that drives home that learning about places is not the same as learning in places. And for I think the challenges ahead of us, we need to continue to attend to these kinds of scale of details when we're engaged in change making. And so I'll just conclude by saying, I think we've heard across these talks tonight, which is not surprising, but climate change demands social and cultural change. And so as we think about learning, if we're not actually engaged in the work of social and cultural change at the deepest levels, I don't think we're going to accomplish our ends. And for me, education is really about how are we supporting humans to learn to live differently with each other and the earth. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Megan, for that great talk. We're going to invite everybody to come back on now for a Q&A session. I just want to remind everybody in the audience to please go ahead and post your questions in the Q&A box on the bottom bar of your screen. And we will be pulling from those. So if you have questions and if they're for anyone in particular, you can write that too. So I guess I'll get us started with a question. So how can educators help adolescents understand and act on distributive and procedural justice in addressing climate change? David, did you want to get us started on that one?
Well, first of all, I'll just say I'm blown away by the presentations. Wow, Deb and Megan, my goodness. What am I doing on this panel? This is phenomenal work. I was just taking notes furiously. So what a fantastic group. Yeah, I'm actually sort of less emphasis on adolescence, but I do think the lessons that I've learned in the classroom, in the lab, and in the field, can apply to some degree. And for me, procedural and distributive justice are really kind of fancy polysyllabic ways of talking about, how do we get things done and how do we understand inequality, how inequality is driving, what we're experiencing. And so one of the examples I gave in terms of Oxnard, California, I think is really poignant for many students at the college level, at the high school level, the middle school level, and earlier, all of whom were involved in that struggle, for whom it wasn't abstract at all. It was like, look, we understand this is a majority people of color community. It's a majority working class, low wealth community, majority or significant percentage of the community is immigrant. So these are folks who are living on the margins of our society. And as we look around, we see that it's exactly these populations that tend to face disproportionate impacts of climate environmental risks and threats. And so in many ways, the students from these communities like Oxnard don't need me to explain that to them, but it is helpful when I place Oxnard in a broader context, and that's what makes the light bulb go off or on, as it were. And then the procedural part then came to be when there were all of these public hearings where people realized, yeah, we're not going to actually be able to intervene with this power plant unless we know when and where the elected officials are meeting, the County Board of Supervisors. All of these public hearings are happening where decisions are being made. We need to know about that, and we need training on how to intervene. And so we did that with non-governmental organizations, our community-based partners, who trained students how to write public testimony, how to deliver that testimony, and how to make a change in the procedural justice process. and they got dividends, they got results. And so for me, I think what we're seeing across all of these presentations is learning by doing really does work.
Maybe I'll just add and an answer to that, and not an answer to the question, but just kind of, David, where you're thinking kind of got me thinking is, I sometimes think one of the things that I'm increasingly concerned about, and think a lot about this, because when I work with Indigenous communities, we both have to push back on the ways in which colonial regimes continue to harm us. And we have to do the work of building our own nations, building our own infrastructures. And for me, part of what I've spent a lot of time with adolescents over the last 10 years or so is not only engaging them in what I call the negation, meaning that they're not only engaged in an activism that is response to harm. They have to do it, no doubt. But there's a question of balance here to me, and there's a question of what it means. Linda Smith said this a long time ago, is that we've gotten practice at seeding our children so they can first be dominated and then liberated. And for me, there's this real question here about how are we continuing to perpetuate those cycles of young people, of new generations, first being dominated and then liberating them. And when and how do we do both and is the question for me. And I feel like I don't know the answers to those things, but I think if we're not concerned about that, I do not think it's an accident that child mental health is rapidly declining and has been for several decades. Right? Young people's mental health is declining, and that's not an individualized problem. That's a societal problem. It's just not how we talk about it.
And I think I would add one thing to that too. The idea, I completely agree. And the idea that how are we actually holding young children? Because we often get asked, like, you know, how young is it too young to talk about climate change? I'm like, there's no too early age. It's around us, it's everywhere. It's a privileged stance to say that you can't talk about climate change with kids at a very young age. And so, like, thinking about how we're talking about intersectional issues of justice and climate change with our children as we raise them, with our children as they enter our classrooms, and thinking about, you know, how we're building community and drawing on the resources that kids bring into this space, as opposed to saying they all have to be the same, right? So, like, learning what it is that are these rich treasures that kids are bringing from their own backgrounds and communities and contexts, and the solutions and people in those communities that are the solutions, and like how we're hearing that across boundaries. And I want to just name specifically, like, my positionality in terms of my racial positionality is white. And I often think about how white children are learning to dominate, to Megan's point too, you know, like, and we need to teach white children not to do that. Like, we need to actually teach them a different way so that they don't have to unlearn domination.
So I'm just looking through our open Q&A. Megan, Deb, and David, if there's any questions that you see there that you'd like to answer.
I actually wanted to jump on the one, if it's okay, about rural context. I see Cheryl. Hey, Cheryl. It would be great to just name that. And I'd like to complicate, first of all, the idea of rural. Rural is not all one thing. There's lots of differences in the rural fabric of America, though we don't always hear that in the rhetoric, and we certainly don't necessarily see that in the way that we interpret voting statistics. But I do want to say that there is an amazing amount of work going on in rural places, some of it in high conflict, like when we're thinking about pipelines, like battles over pipelines. When we're thinking about, in my own region, we're thinking about the carbon corridor that happens with shipping in the Salish Sea. And so, there are battles going on in those spaces that are being fought by rural peoples and that are part of this larger societal sort of economic machinery. So we can't separate understanding global economics from local rural issues because they're very much entwined. So I would think that's one of them, and really trying to tie into that to connect with what folks are experiencing and seeing and situating in them those larger understandings.
Yeah, if I could just make a point, I just dropped in the chat a book that a colleague of mine, Loka Ashwood, wrote recently called "For-Profit Democracy: Why the Government is Losing the Trust of Rural America." And I think that offers some really great insights that as Deb and Cheryl were talking about, that complicate some of the taken for granted common wisdom about how we think about rural America. But I would also say that the Journal of Rural Studies has recently published a number of great articles on environmental justice and rural communities around the world. And one of the points that is made there is that as urbanization expands, and the recent revelation that the majority of human beings, right, are in urban areas, the fact is rural areas are become that much more important to fueling urbanization and capitalism. So there's a way in which the way we think about and marginalize rurality in rural communities actually forgets or ignores the fact that precisely because of these same processes, they are that much more important. And also just want to thank Megan for making that point about Indigenous peoples around the world living on and stewarding so the most critical biodiverse areas on planet Earth, and how, as she and other scholars have pointed out, if we're serious about sustainability, it's not so much about appropriating traditional environmental knowledge, it's about listening to and collaborating with and working with Indigenous folks and learning from them, because they have been stewarding this land for millennia.
Yeah, just to build on that, David, I think there are a couple of people who asked questions about this. And I'll tell you one thing that I'm concerned about, and then I'll give some advice about this. And it's exactly your point is, I'm not sure I think Indigenous knowledge systems should be engaged in every learning environment anymore. And here's why. I see more people interested in our knowledge and systems than our people, than our personhoods, than our actual bodies and presences. And it is a trend that has emerged pretty dramatically when kind of a Western knowledge system being like, oh, there's something to this. I want to know what you know, but I'm not responsible for the social dynamics that actually left people not knowing for a while. So I say that can't have all of our brilliance, but none of our presence. And so there's a question here about how do you form those relationships? And here's it's connected to a couple other questions that I saw too. Is tribal nations have been starved for resources. If you look at the breakdown of the dollar for dollar match that public schools get compared to tribal schools, it's fractions. We get fractions of the health dollars. The under-resourcing of tribal nations is dramatic. So when you go knock on a door and say, hey, partner with me, teach me, one, do your homework, know the history of the land that you're on, right? It's a choice now. You can Google, you can go to every nation's website. There are beautiful websites that can tell you the history. So do your homework. Two, you have to think about what's your added value to a community. Why should they take away the much needed effort towards our own children and families and communities towards broader collective goods? The problem is most of us try to do it, which is partly why our lifespans are shorter than most people's because of the expanded stress, right? We have the shortest lifespan of anyone in North America. And there's lots of reasons for that. But my point is you got to think about the conditions of partnership, right? What are you bringing to a relationship and how are you doing that? And so, I think increasingly many tribal communities are looking for partnership, are recognizing influence, but they also can frankly, I get asked all the time, want to partner, want to be a co-PI on this next NSF grant? And if your first contact with me is to ask me to partner in some leadership role on a project we've never discussed, you already played yourself, right? You're not interested in a relationship. You're not interested in really my thinking. You're interested in a transaction to access more resources. And there are versions of that all over the place that happen. So I would really think about like, what are your relational conditions that you're setting in motion? And I'll be honest, I think most of the time educators move at a scale, and I think scholars and researchers want things to happen much more quickly. So half the time we can just wait you out, because if you're not serious about it, you'll stop asking pretty darn quick and move on. And you got to really recognize that you're investing in a transformative relationship. I've been doing work in different communities than my own for 2 or 3 decades. I still go there every year. Don't have any projects, aren't doing any current work. But I knew when I engaged in the work, I was making a life commitment. This wasn't like a casual, coffee date. We went there, and then I made new family, I made new kin, and I have responsibilities to that kin. So that may be dissatisfying. I'm happy if someone wants to follow up. I know there were a couple questions, happy to follow up and give a little bit more specific. I will also tell you there's a framework about forming partnerships with Indigenous communities that will be up on Learning in Places in the next week. So there's also that will help step you through it.
I think at one point I'd add to that is that, and I think of this as the showing up, like showing up in community and doing the things that are just needed to be done in community and not with any particular goal. And that's one way to start building relationship in community, really meaningful partnerships. In Canada, with First Nations here, one of the things that we have been doing for about 8 years in my own community is a community-to-community reconciliation effort. And those types of relationship building work is understanding history, understanding trauma, understanding a lot of different aspects of what's gone on in place, and then listening to what the community themselves want to lead with, and then figuring out how to resource that. And so we're not necessarily driving that work, like we being in terms of like the community that I live in. We're supporting that work, and we're building new collaborations together over a long period of time. And it is a challenge, I think, in terms of educators, when we think about the mobility of many folks who are moving from community to community, it creates a real problem for creating deep justice relationships in and with community. And so that's something that has to be really thought about as we decide ourselves as educators where we want to be and how we want to dig in to community and understand the context in which we're working and understand the communities we're working with.
Yeah, I just want to say I agree with all of that. I think one of the things that is really powerful, I think, about so much of what I see in the field of environmental justice studies is that scholars, many of us, are expected to first advocate for the communities we're working for, and second, if even second, to think about where we're going with research and publication. So from the very beginning of graduate school, I back in 1991, 1992, I started working with an organization on the south side of Chicago, People for Community Recovery, founded by Hazel Johnson, the Black mother of the environmental movement. And some 30 plus years later, I still maintain contact with that organization. The whole point that we've seen in so many of these three presentations around power sharing also comes through in what I've been involved in, the Central Coast Climate Justice Network. This was a network that was deliberately constructed to try to address the history and ongoing tensions between BIPOC communities and mainstream white environmentalists, the history of nativism, of racism. And so we've consciously come together to try to not quash that, but try to address it. Every time we meet, we go through our principles that have led to the founding of this network, and we do anti-racist trainings every year. And we have a steering committee that is led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And the majority of the folks in this network are Black and Indigenous and people of color who themselves represent those communities. So we're very, very clear that those histories matter and that power sharing has to be the name of the game throughout this work, and that research and scholarship and anything that I and others may be involved in comes secondary or tertiary to actually making change on the ground. So this is all really, really helpful discussion for affirming that.
Thank you so much. So Megan, you spoke a lot about the ways that schools and education systems reproduce colonialism through Western ideas of human dominance and separation from nature. And you both given great, you and Deb have both given great resources, I think, for teachers to learn how to contest that more in their learning spaces. I was wondering if you both could say a little bit more about how teachers might think about navigating standards that reproduce certain kind of ideas about like technology as, or sorry, nature as a resource and technological centric solutions. How can they think about navigating those standards?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So I appreciate it. Here's what I do with lots of teachers. So I teach pre-service. I run several in-service teacher PD programs as well. And here's the thing, is educators are usually positioned to prioritize standards as the driving learning goal. And I know I have some colleagues on here who's getting a little nervous about what I'm about to say. But here's the thing. What we've learned in our learning environments is actually when we go for these broader, bigger ideas that are rich in this way, the standards are easy to meet. You actually get much richer learning in place. And so what I would say is that if you're only shooting for the standards, and if you feel dominated by the standards, rather than agentic in utilizing those tools, the standards are actually, lots of them are good. They're not complete in my mind. I don't know any good public policy that is complete. That's not how our policy making works, right? It's just not. People don't reach for the best possible policy. It's the lowest common denominator is how we do things in the United States. So the thing is that if you're only looking for standards, you'll probably actually reproduce a lot. I will, however, say that NGSS, I am really happy to say that NGSS is the first science standards in our history that recognizes that science and scientific thinking is a cultural phenomena, that kiddos don't leave their cultural backgrounds, their value systems, their identities at the door. It is embedded in NGSS. Here's what happens. Most educators look at the standards and not the framework. So if you're an educator and you have not read the framework, I highly encourage you to do that, because the framework reanimates the standards in ways that I think are really, really important. And usually what happens is that oftentimes educators feel dominated by them. That's not your fault, but I am saying to you that there is a real shift that has to happen. I want to take up the problem with technological answers for everything. I am very concerned about that paradigm as the only practical paradigm that people have bought into. There is a way in which that paradigm suggests that people aren't willing to change, societies can't change. And so what we really should do is prevent technologically less dense, I didn't say sophisticated, less dense, less saturated places from being able to access new technologies or think about technologies. Here's the problem. I could play out the same logics about why we thought segregation was permanent in the United States for a while, or why we thought different social arrangements were impossible to shift, right? Part of it is actually an investment in particular positionings and ways of life. And it's why for my work, like our task is helping people to learn differently. We all are going to have to learn to consume less, right? We're also going to have to decide, how do we spend our time? And for me, I saw a question that is there evidence of this? There is a lot of evidence that children spend more and more time on screens we're all on. Not everybody in the world spends this much time on a computer. And those of us that do, those of us that are using internet are actually gobbling up resources left and right for our entitled intellectual activity. So we really have to think through all of these dimensions and recognize at what grain size are we talking about changing how we live.
There's a couple other thoughts around that, around the idea that, and I think this is sort of rooted in much of what Megan just said, is that climate change is not a scientific problem. Climate change is a social problem. And so really thinking about how we're shifting our social systems that have been around these systems of dominance and power, and rethinking those relationships, both with each other and with the environment and more than human. And there's a saying, and I don't think I'll get it quite right. There's a saying in the South Pacific that rich people are happy people. And like it's a different way of thinking about wealth and about thinking about what matters in the world. And this gets back to that idea of like ethics and values that Megan mentioned earlier as well. So really understanding like what are the things that we need to dream into our shared future that are going to actually make it manageable, make it something where we're going to be not just equitable, but that we're going to actually collectively find a way forward and survive. And so sometimes I have those dark days too, like many of you after reading the IPCC report. But I look at that and I also look at all the work that is going on in collective spaces where people are pushing back against those individual paradigms and shifting social arrangements. And that's where I start to see the hope in the space.
Well, we're coming up close to time, so I will just say, Dan, do you have a particular question, or we can also just ask if anyone has any kind of final thoughts to leave our audience of educators.
No, I don't have a final question. Is there among the panelists, is there a closing parting thought given what we've talked about thus far?
I'll just say I'm super honored to be on this panel, and I'm looking forward to checking out all of these resources that folks have provided. So thank you.
I think maybe one of the last thoughts I have is really about, I hear a lot about the urgency of the climate crisis. And I know that many of us feel that way, but I would caution us to think that, to understand that there are differences in the way time is even perceived culturally. And so really thinking carefully that urgency often leads to white environmentalism and like a type of injustice double down on environmentalism that we have to really attend to and be cautious of, because we all feel it. We see the things happening around us. We understand that the world is shifting in really harmful ways. And we need to think through solutions that are actually going to be sustainable in equitable ways going forward, because the injustices and the current sort of values and ethics underneath our system is what got us here in the first place. So we need to think differently about how to get ourselves out of it.
I have to say thank you. Deb, I was actually going to point to Kyle White's work exactly about this. So I really feel like that is a really important point. I think, I really think that we have to be, motivation by fear doesn't have a good history in human societies. It hasn't necessarily led to the most remarkable just times we've ever heard of. And so I just would, I think it's really important what Deb has talked about. That doesn't mean that we can not take any action. And so the other thing that I would just say to educators, like doing something, trying is better than doing nothing. And also recognize as you try, you're definitely going to make mistakes that'll potentially make you cringe at some point. But that's part of what it looks like to learn and continue to grow about this. And, you know, one of my favorite things I tell my students that if you're not making new mistakes, then you're probably getting pretty comfortable in wherever you're at. So thank you all for the leadership and the organizing. I'm so excited to see the rest of these webinars too. It's a great lineup.
Well, Megan, David, and Deb, thank you so much. It's been an honor to get to listen to your talks and have you here together. So I know that we're really grateful. And to everyone asking about resources and recordings, since you registered, you'll receive an email with a link to view the recording. And we'll be working on getting this video posted online as well. Anything to add, Dan?
No, this is, I was hoping to go to bed earlier tonight, but this is going to keep me up, I think, for a little while here. This is just so rich and stimulating. So thank you all three of you. And thanks for everybody for coming. Thank you for your presence and thank you for your questions. So.
Yeah, thanks for being here, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you.